Hi guys, my name is Carlos Restrepo and this is Welcome to episode 1 of Classical Conditioning, featuring the one and only Dr. Stuart McGill. Now some of you guys may be sitting there asking yourselves, well Carlos, who is this McGill character? Well, let me tell you a few things about Dr. Stuart McGill. His laboratory and experimental research clinic investigated issues related to the causal mechanisms of back pain, how to rehabilitate back pain people, and enhance both injury resilience and performance. He was a professor at the University of Waterloo for 32 years. Currently, he is Chief Scientific Officer for BackFit Pro Incorporated. He's worked with legal experts, medical groups, and elite athletes and teams from all over the world. So, if you're suffering from some back pain and perhaps you're trying to lift over 1,000 pounds, or maybe you're trying to knock somebody out in the UFC to win some gold, or, maybe you're just trying to be the best double bass player you can be, or even most importantly, the best person that you can be by educating yourself on your back, well then Dr. McGill is the right person to go for the information. Without further ado, here it is. So just a little bit of a clarification. With the first question that I asked Dr. McGill, I used the term thoracic extension. Now what I'm referring to is the fact that musicians tend to have an excess amount of thoracic flexion. Now if you don't know what thoracic flexion is, that's okay. What I'm referring to is, let me see. I'm talking basically about having too much of that Hunchback of Notre Dame swag, which is definitely not cool. So I hope you guys enjoy.
Yeah, well, welcome to BackFit Pro, Carlos.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think initially, maybe some of the first things that I can ask is, I did want to talk about thoracic extension. And I know that seems to be a pretty big deal for musicians just because of the positioning that they're in. Cellists for sure, trumpet players, violinists, and it's almost kind of a position that you can't really get away from. So I was wondering kind of what's your intake on that?
Well, several thoughts come to mind, and if I can start with talking about concepts first and then specifics afterwards. First of all, that big pregnant violin that you play is not going to change shape. It's not going to change its depth, so you're not going to be able to get easily around it and any closer. So that's the reality of what you've chosen. The first concept is that everything in biology has a tipping point. So consider a vitamin. If you are vitamin deficient, say in vitamin D, you will not be well. But if you take the right amount, you'll have optimal health up to a tipping point, and then more of the same vitamin D turns into a poison for your body. Workload and stress on your body is following exactly the same concept of a tipping point. So musicians don't always consider the magnitude of load on their body, but now we have to discuss the concept of what load is. So your body is made of tissues and they sustain stress from being loaded. Well, that load can come from a magnitude of load, but that's not really the musician's issue. Load also comes from duration and frequency. Now that's the musician's world, because you play a long time in static postures and you are hammering away, stroking away, repetitive movements, building cumulative load. So those are all thoughts about the musician's situation in terms of biomechanical stress. Well, you asked very specifically about your thoracic spine. When I watch you in your postural habits, and you've come up to Gravenhurst and to my home clinic here, I actually watched you come in the door and take your shoes off and carry your instrument downstairs. And your, what I would call spine hygiene throughout all of those things was really excellent. Because poor posture throughout the day adds to that cumulative load and steals your capacity to practice and play without crossing that tipping point that will eventually lead to pain. Now, some people think it's, well, are musicians athletes? Do they get hurt? And the answer is absolutely they are. I do see both modern music musicians and classical music musicians who have stressed their tissues to the point where not only have they become painful, but they've actually become damaged. So take the calluses on your finger. You have adapted the calluses. Now, you know the first time that you did that, they became sore.
Yeah.
But they didn't create a permanent damage. You created an adaptation. So that's what you're doing with your body with playing, but it requires that you follow the laws of biology and don't cross the tipping point. So in terms of your thoracic spine, your posture is very good. But the reality of it is you have to, that's a big instrument, so you've got to reach down, and part of that movement comes from your hips, your low back, and then your thoracic back. So then I have to ask you a question. What is most uncomfortable, or do you ever get to the point of so much pain that you have to stop playing?
I can't really say that that's happened anytime recently.
Well, fantastic. So you're staying under the tipping point, and
Yeah.
that's what it's all about. So you build a bigger tipping point, or the capacity underneath that tipping point, through interval training, and that's your practice and rest schedule. So it sounds to me as though you're doing quite well there. But over time, you will see some people who adapt strange postures that become rather permanent because of the time they spend in front of a keyboard, or at a drum kit, or I had a violinist. I don't know what the #1 violin of an orchestra is called. Is it chief violinist or something, lead or concertmaster, or whatever. And that violinist was really getting into difficulties in that they could really not play very well for very long anymore. So that was their career. So what we did with them was we would interlace their fingers and put them behind your head and pull your elbows around. And if I could get you to lift your head up, and I'm just going to form a hoop now, and I'm going to pull your elbows together. Now, I'm creating a fulcrum across your back, and then just push your elbows down into me, 1 kilo. Don't be strong. No, just 1 kilo. There we go. We're going to count to 10, and then relax, and I'm going to pull you up. Now do it again. Just push down 1 kilo into me. And we're counting to 10, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm not a very good musician, so I should be counting 4 times. But anyway, up you come now, relax, and I'll do it 1 more time. Now, put your arms down, and you'll find all of a sudden we've done a little biomechanical reset, and we've de-stressed your thoracic spine. So there's a little trick. You could actually do that on a chair, on your hands and knees, and build more playing capacity if your thoracic spine was the part of your body that was accumulating the most stress.
Yeah.
So there's a few concepts, and then a specific for you, since you mentioned thoracic spine. But something else just came to mind. What I did for you was a restorative exercise. And exercises are tools. And you choose a tool out of your toolbox to perform a specific task to achieve a specific goal. So when you said, all right, I am concerned about my thoracic spine, I went and pulled out a tool specifically for that. But I see some people and some musicians getting together with trainers, and the trainer gives them a general strengthening program.
Yeah.
And that's kind of weird, because they just chose tools. You know, when you build a house, you choose your tools for the task. And great trainers and great programming of exercise for musicians has to be done the same way.
Yeah. A concept that I heard you talk about with regards to strength push versus kind of more pulse elastic sort of athletes, and kind of trying to see where does the musician line that, because obviously if you need a bit of like spinal flexibility, then it's something like trying to go through a more powerlifting route beneficial, knowing that, you know, what you need to be a successful powerlifter is to have that sturdiness to be able to accumulate or to be able to take that load, right? So that's kind of always been something for me, is where does the musician lie in that degree with regards, I feel like we need kind of a lot of flexibility. We are in these static positions, so maybe we do need a bit of sturdiness within that so that everything else can be mobile, but I feel like we're kind of clueless with regards to that.
Well, that may or may not be the case, but I will say the musicians that I've been asked to consult with, yes, they're clueless. So, but you know, I'm just seeing the ones with my world is back pain. So I'm seeing the failures and the ones who have accumulated back pain. I'm not seeing the success stories. But having said that, when you treat everybody like an athlete, you arrive at a solution. So let's talk, again, a general concept before we get to a specific. In order to create the most healthful exercise program for anybody, you start by asking the question, what are the demands required for you to play your gig? Now, playing a gig might be shortstop in Major League Baseball, or your gig is literally that, playing double bass. And what are the physical demands on your body associated with playing double bass? So if I was to lead you a tiny bit, I would suspect that back muscle endurance would be high on the list. I would also suspect low back and hip endurance, because just to let the cat out of the bag a little bit, when I was in junior high school, I played the double bass, which I might just try your bass just to bring back some old memories in a few minutes. But nonetheless, when you go back in history, there's been all kinds of characters who've been required to adopt the position of a double bass. And you're going to think this is kind of funny, but I was asked to consult with the SWAT team of a major city, and these are the elite police officers. Number one on the SWAT team, who takes a knee with his assault rifle. Number two stands behind him with a rifle for about 20 minutes. Now that's not too different from playing a double bass, if you'll notice that. And the exercises that we created for them was dominated by posterior chain endurance. Well, just stand up for me, Carlos, for just a second. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do is bend forward now. You can carry a rifle or your double bass. You see how that's almost the same? Now, I'm just going to shape your back, and that's just about perfect. So I'm going to get back to the concept of elastic equilibrium. But your hip joints were made to flex and bend. Your spinal discs are a little bit of a different category. They're not a ball and socket. They're actually made similar to a fabric. Mm-hmm. And repetitive movement in a fabric works the fibers loose over time. But we can get back to that concept. But now what I'm going to do, just feel what goes on in your posterior chain. If I ask you to push your knees into my hands now, push your knees out. Did you feel your glutes activate?
Yeah.
And you'll actually find they create a better home base for your mass that sit on top of that platform. So one little trick to increase your endurance while you're playing is, instead of me giving you a knee resistance, stiffen your knees and try and spread your feet apart. But I don't want to see your knees. I just want to see that effort through your hips, and head up just a little bit, and you'll find that that offers a little bit more endurance. So when you're getting tired and you have to finish off that piece, there's a little bit of a trick from the athletic world to apply to musical endurance. But that came from another occupational athlete, and I'll call musicians occupational athletes, for increasing their endurance. But you turned on your gluteal muscles to keep the posterior chain active.
Yeah.
And they're bigger than your back muscles. But anyway, there's just a crazy little analysis and parallel for you.
should kind of your ability or your natural hip mobility be something also to consider?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And with that violin player that I was mentioning earlier, they have to perch on the front of their chair to, first of all, express their music and flow with their body. I get all of this to get into the piece and put expression into it, so I get all of that. But just as they, we call it hooching back into their chair, we had a little lumbar support that was actually on a waistband. So there was just a nice little modification for them. And particularly, horn players and wind players can take advantage of that. I did mention I had a drummer from a rock musician not too long ago, and we played around with the concept of this stool, as you're seeing, which is basically a Harley-Davidson motorcycle seat on a stool that raises and lowers. But if you'll watch what happens, the typical drummer sits on a throne like what you have, which is basically just a round pad. Mm-hmm. But what this rear bolster does, when you sit back on it, if I slouch, the bolster actually rolls my pelvis forward. And when I can roll my pelvis forward, did you see how my spine aligned for free? It didn't require more muscle activity, hence the load decreased, and I can now drum for a longer period of time. And I would submit that that would help several musicians as well. But there's always a trade-off and a cost. When you migrate stress from one area of the body, it has to go somewhere else. So what I have done in that maneuver, you'll notice, is I've pinched my hips now. So I have seen people who sit a lot in their jobs and have to move around either manufacturing parts in the factory or playing an instrument, where they get a pinch in what's called FAI, femoral acetabular impingement. And now that very much is governed by individual anatomy. So a hip exam, or it would be just easier for the person simply to do this, sit with your knees together and feel the stress. Sit with your knees apart and see if the stress is relieved. If it's relieved, don't wear a skirt, wear black pants that aren't tight. That's another trick. Liberate your hips, and now you've de-stressed your hips and your back, and you just built more capacity to play. Anyway, I'm running off of the mouth, but these are all concepts. Mm-hmm.
A lot of people use a footstool. Now, is the symmetry that you have sitting down, does that play an effect in terms of the mechanics of your back? A lot of people, let me see where I have mine. I think I have it right behind you.
Yeah,
and
this is interesting because you're not a symmetric athlete. You're asymmetric, and you carry the, is this called the neck?
Yeah.
Okay, so you carry the neck on the left side, and you curl around your instrument. So to set up with asymmetrical support is perfectly valid.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because this is like, I mean,
yeah.
This is pretty standard in terms of how people play. Instruments in the middle, you can kind of put the instrument here, it loads the weight here, and it allows you to kind of free up and play like that.
I just came back from Costa Rica yesterday morning, and I was listening to a classical guitarist there in exactly the same setup as that. Tall stool, left hand there. And they played fantastically for quite a period of time. So it was their strategy to de-stress their body, rest the guitar here instead of holding it up, and it worked. So if you want a concept or a logic, though, in the world of sports, there are many asymmetric sports. You know, you can think of something like golf or tennis. But even in the fighting sports, there's a southpaw and a traditional stance, and all of these things create asymmetries. Sometimes you just let the symmetries be, but other times the symmetries create abnormal stress to the point of pain. So then you might do corrective exercises to correct the asymmetries, because you still have to live the 22 hours a day when you're not playing. So sometimes corrective exercises are helpful, and maybe you want to do a little bit of hip mobility or asymmetric strengthening.
Mm-hmm.
But
it makes sense. You're playing an asymmetrical instrument. Might as well have an asymmetrical setup at the bottom.
yeah, and what's so interesting when you measure the asymmetrical athletes, they don't test symmetrical. And I would also submit to you that if you tried to make a baseball pitcher symmetrical, they wouldn't throw a 100-mile-an-hour fastball anymore, and they'd be in pain. So we all adapt to these things, and whether you correct them or not, there are some corrective exercise Nazis out there that I will take umbrage with. I see the products of some of their screw-ups with some of their athletes who have back pain, where they're forced to be made symmetric, and their bodies are actually becoming stressed.
Because we have that music that's huge with like private lesson teachers. Maybe you'll get somebody, I mean, I've had comments, people say, this is ideal. This is kind of home base, and you need to somehow find a way to get to this. And then, you know, for me, I'm a smaller double bass player, so I'm just like, I already have this huge thing here. My arms, I don't think are going to grow any longer. And then, for example, even with us here, there's always this goal to be symmetrical. But maybe like you said before, that why be symmetrical when what you're doing is already asymmetrical?
The base is biased on this side of your body. You're de-stressing it by putting one foot up there, resting the base there. And so I don't know. You haven't convinced me otherwise.
Okay, well that's huge, because that's a huge debate for people about, like, do you use the footstool, do you not use the footstool? Some people preach by not using the footstool, some people do, some people say it should be closest to the ground as possible.
Carlos, do you want a rule of thumb?
Sure.
People who are absolute usually don't know very much. When you assess the biological spectrum, which is what we all are, we are all come in different shapes and sizes. We have different leg lengths to body lengths, different elasticities in our body. There are no rules. Again, from a concept point of view, when you know what's required to play an instrument, go measure if the person has those capabilities. And if they don't, you might want to advise them to choose another instrument, or maybe even another pastime. But if they're pretty close, you should be able to create programming to allow some adaptation in their body that's, again, below the tipping point, and they're actually adapting in a positive way. And not crossing the tipping point into that area where they are getting very painful and actually creating measurable tissue change and damage.
Mm-hmm.
So, no, there aren't any absolutes, but I'm suggesting a few techniques on how to arrive at a solution. Know the instrument, what's required, know the person's body, that only comes from assessment, train the differences, and see if you can get that person to the level that they need to be to play well and put in the length of time that's needed.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that I wanted to talk to is grip strength, so I've seen a lot of music almost to the point I've heard people say, it seems like they're telling us not even to exercise, because, you know, it's either like a gym or a weight is seen as something that's so negative. People think, well, I'm going to lose my dexterity for all the digital mechanics that I have to do. People think, oh, well, these calluses on my hands. It's kind of something that's kind of weird, because for me, coming more from a Muay Thai background first, actually, before being a bass player, I've always thought that well, these are, you kind of need, if you're doing all these corrective exercises, you need your hands, and your hands are going to be put in certain positions, but also, I sometimes think people think of everything to the extreme, like as if, oh, you're asking me to go to the gym and squat, so I guess you want me to go and do 300 pounds, when I think people don't realize that there's definitely a range where you can get the work that you need done without kind of going into this extreme of, I'm doing body weight pull-ups, or I'm doing weighted pull-ups for 300 pounds or something like that, which I could maybe see where a certain adaptation could happen. But I feel like we're a little bit too scared about grip strength. We're a little bit too shy about, which is understandable, but I don't know, I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, just listening to all of that, I guess I have several thoughts, and you probably know where this is going. There's two sides to the coin. So I'll start off on one side, and I'm going to flip over to the other side. And that's usually the way we go at things. You'll find that people, once they learn the reality and the facts, they make the best decisions on their own. So usually my job is just to give them both sides and let them decide. I'm not the type that's going to say that's the right way. So let's go on the side of maybe having more strength is not the answer, and it could be a mythical concept. So I'm going to give you some examples of that. In professional basketball, when you measure the best rebounders, they have weaker hands. So you were talking about grip strength. Now you could argue, well, is that because they need more finesse on the ball and more athleticism to do this rather than that? That may be, but that's interesting and that's measurable. Then we get into athletics that require extreme speed. So your people are going to freak at this, but if I just stand up and I do this. Now, there was a pulsing athleticism. So if I was going to throw a punch and just be quick with that, I didn't use muscle. And if you're a Muay Thai man, you will know that the speed of limb firing out, you require several concepts, but it actually is facilitated on the rate of muscle relaxation. So you have to create proximal stiffness or home base, and then you create a pulse, boom, and then you have to let it relax, because a muscle contracts and stiffens and creates force. So you need the pulse of force, but if you keep the muscle active, you push the punch and you're slow. So we've measured in a whole variety of speed athletes the techniques that they use to be fast. And as a muscle pulse, boom! Now, if I used force all the way through and pushed it, I would have been slow. And then for impact as well, I have to relax, don't worry, I have to relax and then stiffen on impact. And I have to be stiff as well. Otherwise, I'll just push myself away, and that wouldn't be very effective at all. So these pulsing patterns are a skill that you measure on the speed of the pulse, like that, which is both on and off. Now, there's a beautiful Japanese study on the world's fastest drummers.
Oh, wow.
And it is exactly the same athleticism that we're just talking about. So for me to, I'm doing a flamicule if you notice that. Anyway, so that pulse and relaxing to get the speed going and faster, 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 it's the neurology of the pulse and your brain's ability to pulse quickly and then shut it off for the movement. Directional change, another pulse, bam, and then get it off. You know what I mean? And then there's a tuned elasticity to it. So, remember the kid who used to do this in high school? I don't know if you can see, no, you can't see that on the video, but what I'm doing is a foot ricochet on the ground. And remember that nervous kid in high school that would drive you nuts doing a foot ricochet? So that only works when you have a tuned elasticity in your body, but you can get faster and faster by changing the tuning. Musicians do exactly the same thing. So to play a really fast piece, and I'm thinking, it's the pulsing neurology once again. So now let's go back to your exercises of deadlifts and doing pull-ups and that kind of thing. Now I'm going to give you another data set. And we've done this a couple of times. I'm going to go back to the world of sport and a volleyball team. So say I gave you an intercollegiate team. So not Olympic level, but they're past high school as well. So a pretty good volleyball team. And I'm going to say to you, increase their vertical jump. And most strength coaches would say do squats to increase their strength and increase their vertical jump. But what you will find if it's a normal volleyball team is half will jump higher after 6 weeks of doing squats. 40% will jump lower. You ruined their vertical jump, and 10% there's no difference. And if you learn to ask two questions, you would have known whether adding more strength increased their performance or ruined their performance. And the first question would have been, say to the players, if you're naturally quick, you go stand over there. And if you're naturally strong, you go stand over there. Now, which group do you think jumped higher and which group do you think jumped slower?
I don't know.
Well, the naturally quick ones, when you add a bit more strength, they actually jumped higher. But the strong ones, when you add more strength to strength, you actually created more stiffness and you slowed them down. So think of Muay Thai now, there's the flick punch versus pushing the punch with muscle, which is slow. So the more force and strength you add, you actually begin to push the jump and you slow down. So when musicians start to push the beat, either on a drumstick or on the bow, to choose your instrument, you will slow down. So there are fight coaches, as one example, who really limit strength training. And I've measured, as you are probably aware, some of the top fighters in the world, and they don't test the strongest on the traditional strength tests, but they have this pulsing neurology, which is second to none. They relax their muscle, and I measured this 6 times faster than the average person walking on the street. The Japanese found exactly the same thing in world-class fast drumming. So it's a neurology. Be a little careful with strength now when you're a musician. The type of strength you need is core endurance for the postures. But when you're getting into hand strength, So as you may or may not be aware, I wrote that last book called Back Mechanic for the lay public. I never thought I would write a book for the lay public, but people kept asking me, would you take your clinical books and make them available for the lay public? And there are some universal athleticisms in there that you can't get away from, whether you're an athlete, a stay-at-home mom lifting your kid out of the crib at 2 in the morning, or playing the double bass. We are a linkage, and you cannot move your limbs if you don't have a stiff core. Otherwise, you can't fire a gun out of a canoe. It doesn't work. So building a little bit of core endurance and endurance in your hips. So exercises like the bird dog, the side plank, the curl up, they're non-negotiable, and it's exactly how we would train number 2 position on the SWAT team. It's exactly how I train a double bass player. But I'd be a little careful with grip strength. I would let your hands fly and be free. Now, I suspect when you get into the syncopation of a violin player, they're going to have to be a little faster than you.
Typically. They will be.
But, modern bass pieces are getting faster and they're getting into the higher registers. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Bach they kept you guys down on the bass clef, didn't they? But not anymore. And when I look at the rock bass players, wow, they really get into the higher notes as well, and a lot faster in I don't know what they call that, where they throb the strings now on double bass and pound them. And
the slap bass.
The slap bass, things like that. So anyway, it's a long-winded story, but I hope I've given you both sides of the equation now. So I would strategically strengthen your body for the core. but I wouldn't be making your hands more strong. I would be practicing the twitching techniques that I taught you, because that is also a skill.
Mm-hmm.
So just learn to just relax for me, and then just give me a little pulse, like too much amplitude. I want you just to twitch. That's better. That's better. I'm going to build a core, and then just flick your fingers 1 centimeter. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So you actually were on quite quickly, but you stayed on too long. You didn't come off fast enough. So just twitch and let it go. There. Now don't do this while you're waiting for the bus. The weight coats will come and take you away. But these are all exercises now that I would strategically tune the body to play double bass.
Yeah. No, that's super interesting. I mean, that almost makes me feel like is martial arts, because I think about that like when I've seen boxers, for example, that I don't see them a lot training weightlifting or traditional things, but it's a little bit frightening to see the speed that they have and the way that they're able to pulsate.
Well, I've measured some of the guys who we all watch in the UFC, and the ones with the big muscles people are afraid of, don't be. They push their punches. It's the ones who don't look so muscular.
Yeah,
that's the thing that is so devastating, and that I would also propose is far more important for some of the more technically quick pieces that you're asked to play. It ain't strength.
yeah.
Anyway, there's a whole spectrum of things to think about, and training your own body to become the master of the bass.
Yeah. Something that I wanted to talk to you, I guess, in relation to exercise is, I guess going back to these extremes of what is too much and what is too little, is almost about things like, having a tight core, having a tight trunk, and kind of everything else loose, but like yoga and kind of where everything else fits in. I mean, for music, especially the double bass, especially classical music, yoga has been a big component, kind of primary source for musicians. Tai Chi is something that's been recommended for musicians. So kind of, it's sometimes I always wonder, is this too much now onto this other side of now it's a little too loosey-goosey, and now we need to be in these stiff positions, but we don't have the strength, we have too much of the looseness, and now we're also getting into, I guess, the other extreme of causing injury.
Well, that's a very astute observation. So just to repeat what I said earlier, the people I see have back pain, so they are the failures. And I would reinforce what you just said when I talk about what are you currently training. And when they say yoga, it's too much the other way. You do need a core stiffness, you can't get away from that. And to add a bit more tone, and it isn't about relaxing and pushing a joint to the end range. The playing posture quite often does that. So generally I'm pulling those people away from a philosophy of yoga and much more stiffening, pulsing, and that kind of thing, similar to what we were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that they're going to stretch away their back pain when they're already a core, static, dynamic limb occupational athlete, being a musician. So that's very astute.
Mm-hmm. The other thing, I guess, because musicians play in different postures and different things, I know that you were talking about the perfect storm and about how sitting is not necessarily what is dangerous, but it's the sitting and then going out and doing something that causes compression that causes the perfect storm. So I was almost wondering, musicians they all do a variety of things. Some jazz bass players play standing. I play standing, but I used to play sitting. So I'm assuming that also kind of implies to what they can do or what they can't do. Because if you're sitting all day, which I know a lot of people do you go and do you do do you work on the stiffness, or now do you go and you sit back and work on the elasticity because you've been compressed for so long?
Well, again, I don't know the answer for a specific individual, but if we were to talk concepts, once again, the ideal world would be doing both. So could you possibly play a very dynamic piece standing? And then if you were not in the score sheet for a couple of pages, sit back on a high stool, something like that, and be more of a perch rather than actually sitting down fully on it, taking all your weight. And there's a strategy that migrates the stress so there's no cumulative concentration in any one area. And now you've got the best of both situations. So there's an example to think about that. It isn't going to work for a French horn player, but it could certainly work for a double bass player.
Interesting. And
but to get back to that perfect storm idea, the body adapts one of two ways, and it adapts to chronic stress. So again, if we take the yoga example, the discs behaving like a fabric, if you keep stressing the fabric and the collagen fibers that make up the discs, they become very mobile. But the downside of that is that when you really squeeze the spine with heavy load, the pressurized nucleus can work its way through the fibers that have been loosened for mobility. So it's a real mistake to try and adapt your body for strength and load-bearing ability on one hand. The extreme would be powerlifting, who wouldn't be suggested for athletes, for musicians at all, because a deadlifter, you may be familiar with the powerlifter who I wrote my recent book with, The Gift of Injury, Brian Carroll. I mean, he squats over 1,100 pounds, but to do that, he needs an extremely stiff spine. You don't need that stiffness to be a musician, so you want to be more towards the opposite end, but you don't want to be so lax that the tasks of daily life, like as I said, if you're a mother with young kids or a dad with young kids and you want to pick them up and play with them, you need a certain resilience in your spine and toughness, so you don't want too much mobility and pushing it to the end range, because that predisposes it to the perfect storm, as we're trying to converge on here. So again, avoiding the heavy yoga and avoiding the big heavy strength exercises is probably the sweet spot of where the musician wants to be. But for a young guy like you who likes to bang around with some martial arts and also play the bass, I still would back off the heavy squats and deadlifts and things like that. That is, over the longer term, probably going to steal some of your musical capacity. But likewise, just doing yoga will do the same thing. So somewhere in the middle is where you're going to have to be to achieve that goal of being the master that you want to be.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about foam rolling, and how does foam rolling kind of place in this world? I guess going back to that strength / flexibility, is it good, is it not good?
Let me get a model and I'll start to answer that question for you. Yes, this is the one. Well, foam rolling has become common and popular, and I have to tell you that I don't have an opinion about foam rolling your gluteals or your quads or your latissimus dorsi, but I do have a little bit of experience with foam rolling the low back. Don't do it. A lot of pain comes from having micro movements. So I'm just going to point this to the camera and I'm going to push the spine forward like this. And if you can see, the majority of the emotion occurs at this joint. Not at this joint and not at that joint, at this joint. That joint because it's been damaged. And you see how most of the motion, the micro movements occur at a single joint because when the disc has been damaged just a tiny bit, it loses some of its pressure. And when you let air out of your car tire, it bulges a bit and it gets a bit sloppy on the road. And you can see the sloppy joint now. And when this doesn't show up on MRI, by the way, but when we take video fluoroscopy of the person's spine and watch them move, we see the majority of the motion, or a greater proportion of the motion, occurring at the single joint. That's usually where the pain is coming from. Almost always, it's where the pain is coming from. Now, here you might have a little bit of that loss of pressure in that disc. You've got a micro movement occurring. Now you get on the foam roller and so your full body weight now pushes there, and then there, and then there, and then there. And what that does is the foam roller also rolls the muscle, which fires off stretch reflexes. So the stretch reflex gives you an analgesic effect. It takes the pain away and gives you a little jolly for your brain for about 15 minutes, 15, 18 minutes perhaps. And then you will find after an hour or two, you will feel the need to stretch or foam roll once again. But now you've made that micro movement even more lax. So now you're increasing the problem. So it's a sort of a nasty trick for your brain and what's called the proprioceptive system. So that's the start of the story why you shouldn't foam roll your low back. With most people who have these micro movements, with my thumb, if this was an actual person, I probe each one of these spinous processes, about 2 kilograms, and I will create their pain and find where the micro movement is. So the foam roll is the weight of your torso on some of these spinous processes. I've also, I know now of 2 cases where people have broken the 12th rib, which is a floating rib, with a thing called the peanut, which is 2 tennis balls, or a lacrosse ball, even worse, on those floating ribs and on the spinous processes.
Wow.
So it's a really contraindicated thing to do. Now, once again, I'm not talking about other areas of the body because I don't know about that. But I wouldn't foam roll a low back. I'm even wary of general massage for back pain because, as it turns out, you are sitting right now with a tone to the muscles. Those muscles are required to set as stiffening tone because your spine will just collapse if you don't have a low residual level of muscle tone. When you take a general massage, the muscles that reduce those micro movements also become relaxed. But a very good masseuse or a very good trigger point therapist or ART person, some of these manual therapy types who are very precise in their treatment, they know what to leave alone and to leave a certain tone strategically, and then what to release. So say a person had a tight quadratus lumborum, which would be the muscle running up here either side of the spine, which is quite common in people with back pain. They would know how to release that, or they would know how to release just a psoas muscle, but leave everything else alone. And these are the gurus who are able to create superior results. I don't have those skills myself. I don't have skills in manual therapy, but I would certainly do what I do to understand the mechanisms, create appropriate exercise programs, change the way they move to stop the cause, but there still might be one little snag in their back, and I would then have to send them off to one of my colleagues who's a very good soft tissue artist, but they're not a general just massage it or smash it with a ball or roll it out. Those are very crude and crass methods that your back's a bit too precious to take such a crude instrument to.
Yeah. Another thing we talked about was breathing. and the capability of breathing with regards to creating stiffness?
Well, again, are we talking about musicians now, or?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, obviously someone who has to breathe to play an instrument is a different kettle of fish from someone like yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I would consider yourself much more along the lines of a martial artist, and you will have to breathe behind the shield. So what I mean by that is there will become pieces where in order to get very fast playing, you're going to have to stiffen your core. Otherwise your core is just going to be unable to create proximal stiffness to unleash the distal bone movements. So breath pressurization is all part of that whole process of taking this flexible rod of the spine, stiffening it to allow faster limb movements, and that's just a law that it's a law of this linkage that you can't work around. You have to. So pressurization of the breath will certainly increase your playing performance.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know necessarily how some of the corrective breathing that is being taught these days on how to belly breathe and sort of the yoga style of breathing, that's not what we measure translates to the field of play in sport or the music hall of someone like yourself who has to play a big instrument. It's more of there are great sprinters, for example, that may not take a breath for the full 100 meters. There are others who might take a little micro breath, a sip, like that at 60 meters, or maybe one at 80 meters. And I suspect it's the same for musicians, where they have to come into a very passionate, violent, quick piece, and they will have to stiffen their body to allow the hands, just like the drummers do.
Yeah.
As I said, the world's fastest drummers. To get faster requires more core stiffness, and you have to create shallow breathing, sipping the air, creating the core stiffness to unleash the limb.
So we talked a lot about like assessment, and I know that you've worked with many doctors, or many doctors have had you come into the office to say, hey, what is going on? And I think as that has happened, there seems to be a look at the clock. And with you, like a lot of musicians that do have problems, how should they think about assessment? Because I think you spend about 3 hours assessing an individual to really get to know what's going on. So maybe somebody goes to the doctor, but the medical system may not be designed that way to really be able to treat them given the complexity of the mechanism involved.
Well, it's not only a physical mechanism. People fail at doing things because of a variety of forces, and it might be a social force. It might be a psychological force. And my assessments begin with just a really good conversation with the person to find out what their habits are, and their back pains might be because of their habits. They didn't realize they were causing cumulative stress in a certain way or moving a certain way. Anyway, that sometimes is a lengthy conversation to pull out why they failed in the past. Because if I do the same thing as all the previous docs, I will fail as well. So we have to find out what those impediments were. But then we get very physical, and we do pain provocation testing, which is putting them into specific postures, having them to move certain ways and under certain loads, and we become very precise in our ability to understand what combination of those trigger their pains. Then we show them how to move in life without triggering those specific triggers. And then we have to figure out, well, what are the demands on their life, and where is their body currently? How can we rebuild this body to create a foundation for the pain-free activities that they want to do, if it's possible. So that takes about 3 hours to do it properly, And there's nowhere in the medical system that allows for such a thing. That's why there's so many people with disabling back pain walking around. No one has given them the time or the expertise to figure out the true cause. So they're given a pain pill, or they might be offered a surgery or something else. But our first job is to remove the cause and then build the foundation for pain-free activity. To do that well takes that time. So I don't know of any other way to do it. It makes so much sense to me, you know. You have to get to the bottom of the cause. You wouldn't take your car into someone and they say, well, my car isn't running right, and they say, oh, well, here, we'll change the engine, or we'll change the, you know, whatever it happens to be. You know, you don't do that. You figure out what the cause is, and then you're very precise in the intervention. So that's what we try and do with backs, and it takes that amount of time. But this is the room where it all happens, and there aren't too many places where we have a patient assessment table beside a squat rack and some implements to create the stresses that we need to understand why they're in pain.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, from what I've seen, a lot of people who get recommended for surgery don't necessarily really need it.
Well, I can give you some statistics on that. I was a professor for 32 years, and I ran the laboratories that probed and investigated pain mechanisms in the back, but we also had a research clinic as well where patients would come in. And those who came in being told, you've exhausted all approaches. You've tried PT, chiropractic, you've seen the neurosurgeon, the orthopedic surgeon, you've been to the psychologist, you've been to the pain clinic, and you still have back pain. So, by default, surgery is your last option. Well, for 95% of the people who had been told surgery is your last option, we got 95% of them to avoid surgery and then to say they were darn glad they did. And we began the process by what we called virtual surgery. Surgery often works because it's forced rest. So you can imagine the musician, and you have to say, well, I don't want you to touch your instrument now for a period of time. We're going to go into rehab. And they say, well, I can't. I have to practice. And I say, okay, well, let me take a knife. I'm going to cut you now, and tomorrow you won't be able to play your instrument. You're going to be in bed trying to get up to go to the toilet. That's the state that you're going to be. But surgery worked for them because it was forced rest. So humor me now, and let's play that game. And that's the beginning. Of course, there's a few more steps along the way. But that's all in the book, Back Mechanic, where we guide the person through that whole process of forced rest and slowly build their body back. 95% of people will avoid eventual surgery. Now, there are obviously those who will benefit, and we give guidelines as to what that should be. The pain should be at one level. One thing that the surgeon can go in and cut the pain out. But if it's multi-level, the chance of a surgeon cutting the pain out, it becomes much more slim. Mm-hmm. So we give them a series of about, well, I forget the number of conditions that they have to meet in order to have a low risk, high percentage surgery.
Oh, wow.
So here is what's commonly known as a dynamic disc bulge. So do you see that little, are we on?
Yeah, we're on.
So do you see that little red mark in the back of the person's disc there? Mm-hmm. And the spinal cord flosses up and down like this with leg movements and head movements. It actually moves well over a centimeter up and down like this with distal limb movement. But anyway, with movement over and over and over again, once it's combined with the right amount of load, it causes the collagen fibers, this isn't a ball and socket joint, these are fibers like in a fabric, to slowly loosen. And then when you pressurize the nucleus behind, and I'm going to bend forward, do do you see how the nucleus comes out and it will press on the nerve root like that? Yeah. But now I'm going to stack the thrust line straight up and down. In other words, I'm not going to allow the spine to bend forward, which creates the disc bulge. I'm going to stack the pressure, and now, do you see how the whole disc squeezes, but nothing is hydraulically forced out of the delaminated fibers? Well, that's a pretty extreme condition, but now I'm going to show you just a painful condition where it hasn't created a full delamination of the fibers. Do you see that little red mark there?
Yeah.
Do you see the red mark growing?
Yeah.
And now I'm going to stack the spine vertically and squeeze. It doesn't go as red. There, I'm flexing, lots of red, and just a tiny bit now. So that's why posture really determines the stress on the fissures going through the delaminated collagen. Anyway, there's different ways to create those collagen delaminations, but there's a little bit of a start on the hydraulics of discs and how they pinch nerves and create pain, and why, when you understand this and document it in a person, it's quite easy to coach them how to move. And if this was you, I would get you perched on the front of your base stool, spread your knees wide apart, and lean through your hips to perform your playing.
Yeah. And that would definitely stimulate, I guess, all the potential things that could happen with my disc as I'm playing.
Well, again, if you've created some of this delamination by doing an overload of deadlifts or power cleans or kettlebell swings with poor form or too much load, this is the cascade of events that can occur. Back pain isn't normal. These stresses that cause these delaminations and whatnot, there's certainly a cause to them, and but it's not a point of no return. If you understand and have defined very precisely the nature of what's going on in the person, then you can certainly create a very targeted avoidance program to allow it to all gristle and stiffen up again and become resilient once again, and which, as you know, we've proven many times in restoring athletic careers.
Hi, so here are 3 awesome Stuart McGill books that I would like to talk to you about. Number 1, Back Mechanic. The secrets to a healthy spine your doctor isn't telling you. The step-by-step McGill method to fix back pain. So, here are the points of awesomeness for this book. Number 1, it's simply hard, cold science. It's the truth. It's been measured. This isn't one of those 5 easy steps to fix your back pain sort of deal. Number 2, there's a lot of myth busting in here. So if you've ever been to the doctor and they tell you, hey man, it's just all in your head, or that the pain will simply dissipate, well, you'd be surprised. Number 3, it's self-empowering. So it's giving you the ability as a reader to be able to fix your back pain. Number 4, it emphasizes the importance of proper movement patterns. And this is really important because what it's really teaching you is how to properly tie your shoes, how to properly bend over, how to properly pick things off the ground, how to properly move. And this is going to spare your back throughout your lifetime. And it's good because it's going to preserve your athleticism for sports, but also for daily life. Then number 5, it talks about the McGill Big 3, which are essential for all of us with regards to maintaining a strong core, but also a healthy back. And then lastly, it will answer the questions that you want to ask, but you may be afraid to. And this is kind of cool because McGill is he's covering all aspects of life. So I don't really want to spoil anything towards the end of the book. But let's just say that McGill has your back in everything. Número 2. The Gift of Injury. The Strength Athlete's Guide to Recovering from Back Injury and Winning Again by Dr. Stuart McGill and Brian Carroll. Hi guys, so points of awesomeness for this book. Number 1, it's a story. It's a story about someone fighting for their dreams in a scenario where everyone and everything around them is telling them no. Number 2, it shows both the angle of the student and the teacher within Dr. McGill and Brian himself. Number 3, it's very raw. Brian isn't afraid to be honest about what works and what doesn't work, and about the lowest of the lows. Number 4, it contains detailed programming. Now, if you're someone like me, you write down your own practice schedules and your own logs, and you kind of train for a performance, it's awesome to see someone else do the same. And it's super detailed in the book, and it's great to read, and it's very interesting to see kind of, okay, this person did this. Is there some way that I can do that with my own training and programming to give myself better performances? Number 5, it talks about all aspects of performances. So everything from visualization to, how your facial features affect your nervous system for performance. And one of the things that I like about the fact that it goes so in depth about performance is that I really think that this is the sort of information that can help anybody with a job interview, can help, anyone, that's trying to do a performance or an audition, or, if you have to perform in any sort of aspect, the details in this book are definitely applicable. And then number 6, it just proves that you should never lose hope.
Hana Dul Set. The Ultimate Back Fitness and Performance, 6th edition by Stuart McGill.
So guys, points of awesomeness for this book. Number 1, it's about understanding the science of training. So a lot of the times when we either go to the gym or when we're on YouTube or searching about the internet to look at what exercises to do, we don't really realize that some of these exercises are scientifically not only proven to not be healthy in the long term, but also to not enhance performance. Number 2, this book emphasizes the concept of the individual. So as an example, Dr. McGill was able to measure an awesome dunker. But this awesome dunker at the time was being told, hey man, it seems like you got some tight hamstrings. Why don't you stretch those things out? And a lot of these guys didn't really realize that the fact that this person's hamstrings were tight were the reason why this individual was able to do awesome things on the court. Number 3, McGill comes at it again just busting a bunch of myths. So if you're interested in the myth busting of stretching and strengthening, then this is an awesome book for you. Number 4, this book gets into in-depth details about awesome concepts. So, for example, things like plyometrics. I think a lot of the times when we either get recommended to do these exercises or we recommend these exercises, we talk a lot about the intensity, but not necessarily about the concepts within these exercises that truly can enhance performance. So in the example of jumping, there should be a discussion definitely about foot landing dynamics, relative heel and body position, arm use, torso posture, and in general balance. These sort of concepts are the concepts that blend performance enhancement and safety. And number 5, what really makes this book awesome is that its main purpose is to educate, prevent low back disorders, and enhance efforts for performance. I maybe thought, to talk about, how you deal with people. As kind of like a last thing, a little bit of a last message to just be like, in the midst of all of this, it does come down to just trying to help people out and just trying to treat people like they'd be like your brother, your sister.
Yeah, well, I guess it sounds biblical, but in your career, you will meet people who you may consider intimidating because of their accomplishments, or maybe they were born into something, like they were born into a royal family or something like that. But as you will find, that people are just people. And one thing that's always helped me in my line of work, because I do have to interact with people of that stature, and the rule has always been, you just treat them as your equal. And if they're an undergrad student just coming out of high school, or you might be asked to go and give a talk at a high school, that they're still people. Or you might be asked to come and play a command performance in front of the royal family of some country. and you meet the people, and you just treat them as your equal at that time, and things always work out. And I think people in that situation appreciate that as well. They get fed up of being placed on a platform that almost takes away from them as a human.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's it.
All right.
Thank you so much, Stu.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Very, very grateful. So that's it. Thank you guys, and I hope you found this to be to be interesting.